Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Walsh, Customer Engagement Manager here at HR Toolkit, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. For those of you who are new to us, HR Toolkit provides HR software for SMEs, and we run an ongoing program of webinars covering a variety of HR business topics. Today, we are looking at how to create a security-conscious culture in your organisation. We'll be looking at how you can improve your organisational culture to have the best possible impact on cyber and information security. Now, today's webinar is going to cover the following. We'll be looking at mitigating security risks from employees, how to create a human firewall, rewarding and reinforcing security-conscious behaviours and actions, and developing a positive security culture. Now, following the presentation, which we anticipate to last around 25-30 minutes, we will also have time to answer some of your questions in a Q&A. So on your Zoom menu, you'll see there's a Q&A box, so please feel free to add your questions here as we go. By all means, get involved with the chat as well, but please, if you've got questions, put them in a Q&A so we don't miss them. Just a quick note on today's session as well. Today's session is offering general, not legal advice. Now, also make sure you sign up for our next webinar, which is on digital presenteeism. I'll add a link to the registration page here in the chat shortly. Okay, so back to today. Here this morning to talk to us about how to create a security conscious culture in your organisation is our very own Chief Technology Officer, Kit Barker. Now, Kit is a managing and technical director with a proven history of developing successful software as a service platforms. Kit is passionate about information security and embedding security at every layer of the business, not just infrastructure and application. So without further ado, I will now hand you over to Kit so he can get started with today's topic, how to create a security conscious culture in your organization. So Kit, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. If I just check, am I sharing my slides correctly now?
Looks fine to me.
Yeah, great. So good morning, everyone. Sorry for the slight technical hitch at the start there. So yeah, thanks for joining. I was going to say hope you're all enjoying the good weather, but of course it's typically it's overcast now. But anyway, so this morning we're going to be talking about security conscious cultures, what they are, how we why they're important, what challenges we face to creating them, and then of course how to overcome these challenges. Like Chris said, we'll have a space for Q&A at the end. Yeah, and I'll be hoping to talk for around 20 minutes. Depends how quickly I speak, really. But yeah, so let's dive right in. So a common question that I come across is, isn't cybersecurity the job of the IT department? And partly yes, firewalls, antivirus, software patches, you know, they're all certainly key parts of cybersecurity, and they are the concern of your IT department. But that is only part of the issue. Security is much more than hardware and software, and this is probably well illustrated by considering the risks that we face. So the most common risk that we face is phishing, really, and that's the most common and the most effective risk. Most software systems, they're really good at spotting mass-mailed, untargeted phishing attacks, but really they've got no chance of stopping a targeted personal email from a real user. Likewise, hardware or software doesn't stop you writing down your password on a post-it note and sticking it on your monitor. People mitigate these risks and stop these attacks, not software. I think that in these scenarios, it's really helpful to consider our approach to health and safety in the workplace. So, with health and safety, most of us are comfortable with the idea that we have a shared responsibility for that. So yes, employers have the legal responsibility to ensure that employees are trained and that they have systems, robust systems in place to manage health and safety, but all employees have a responsibility to maintain the health and safety of the workplace and the health and safety of their employees. In the same vein, in the modern workplace, all employees have a responsibility for maintaining cybersecurity. So is cybersecurity an IT issue? Well, by its very nature, yeah, it is. But given the role of IT in everyone's workplace, it's our issue too. Essentially, we're all in IT now. So what does it mean to have a security conscious culture? Well, I think it boils down to two pretty simple statements. One is people know what to do, and two, they do it. So that's it. Thanks for joining us. See you next time. Well, clearly it isn't that straightforward. It seems simple, but it is really something that's hard to achieve. But why is that? What are the problems and challenges that organizations face? Essentially, it's the reverse of the previous slide. So first of all, people don't know what to do. And this is the security conscious part of it, I guess. And cybersecurity is complex. It changes rapidly. It's seen as scary, and it's often seen as someone else's responsibility, as we've talked about previously. It's seen as the IT department's responsibility. On top of that, organizations don't really prioritize training, even though IT is an integral part of our everyday life. The ONS recently reported that less than 15% of employees receive any IT training, and we can hazard a guess that cybersecurity training is going to be even less than that. So how are people going to know what to do if we're not training them? And it's not just employees though either. Many organizations don't know what to do either. There's no equivalent of the HSE mandating cybersecurity laws. We do have the Information Commissioner's Office, and they do offer some really good advice and training. And there are plenty of data protection laws, but to many it feels more messy and much less clear than the health and safety legislation. And the second problem we face is, and you can guess it if you can remember the previous slide, is that people don't do it. And there are many reasons for this, apart from the fact that people don't know what to do. Often people don't follow best practice because they don't understand the risks to the organization, or they don't feel that those risks are real. Cybersecurity attacks are something that happen to other people, and really, is it that bad if I have a really weak password? Or it may be that they do have the training, but it's just too abstract or relevant to their role, and there's no clear guidance. And finally, an essential part of security is fixing breaches quickly or fixing problems quickly. However, when mistakes happen, people are often afraid to own up to them, and this gives problems time to grow. And this is the worst possible outcome for everyone. Well, except from the hackers and the scammers, it's good news for them. So how do we become security conscious? Those are the problems. How do we address them? And I'm going to suggest that there's three main items to look at. So one is application of policies. People don't know what to do, so we address that by the application of clear and effective policies. We also address the knowledge gap by providing sufficient relevant awareness and training. And because people are often afraid to admit to mistakes, we foster a culture of reward rather than one of punishment and blame. So we'll look at each of those in turn. So policies. I know I've probably sent some of you to sleep now with a mention of policies, but please bear with me. I really want to make you love a good policy. Policies do have a bad reputation, but I think that's because they're not created well or implemented well. They're misunderstood. So, I mean, effectively, what is a policy? It's just a simple mechanism for an organization to clearly detail the expected behavior of their employees. But that is it. So what is a good policy, and why do we get it wrong? First of all, a good policy should be short and simple. It should be quick and easy to read using audience appropriate language. Yes, you can use jargon if it's helpful, but often people writing policies, they go into some kind of lawyer mode and use overly formal or legal sounding language. And there's no requirement to do this, and usually it isn't helpful at all. The other part of simple there is that it needs to be simple to implement and realistic. If you have a policy that states that you should, to protect you against opening up a malicious attachment, that you should delete all emails with attachments, that might be secure, but it's just impossible to implement. You can't do that and do your job effectively, because most people's job requires accepting some attachments. And it's critical as well that a good policy will have simple steps to do when people don't follow those. You know, we need to assume that people aren't going to follow them at some point. People are going to make mistakes. The second part is that policies need to be kept relevant, and they need to be reviewed and updated frequently. How often will really depend on the policy, but once a year, probably a good start. Or even better, you can encourage people to suggest changes whenever they notice that the policy needs it. This could be due to your processes changing, best practice being updated, whatever the reason. The policy is seen to be out of date, then it needs to be changed, because your policy is worthless if it doesn't actually reflect reality. And we need to see that the policies are flexible. We don't want to enter a situation where adhering to a policy is held above all else, regardless of whether or not that is practical or sensible or reflects the actual reality. And finally, and perhaps this is most important, is that policies need to be shown to apply to everyone. You know, most importantly, the directors, C-level employees. It can be the case that they can be seen to disregard policies. So, you know, ask yourself this: in your organization, would you, or do you think your staff would, if you are an owner or director, would staff feel able to highlight to a director when they weren't following best practice? And if your staff don't feel able to do this, then you are opening yourself up to a huge risk. Targeted attacks are increasing in complexity and sophistication all of the time. And often the CEO, you know, they hold the keys to the kingdom in a lot of cases. So they are the primary target. So in reality, the more authority a person has, the more concerned about process and procedure that they really should be. And finally, if employees see their managers not bothering to follow policies and procedures, they're just going to copy and follow suit, and then that's no good for anybody. So as a bit of an aside, and in my bid to convince you that, you know, policies are great and can be fun, I just want to share this. This is a snippet from one of our old development policies. This was created, if you can't guess by reading it, it was created around the time that all of our tech team were watching Game of Thrones. And so I'll just read out a little section. The Father of Dragons changes fortnightly via a dev team chosen rotation. This is currently clockwise rotation based on the seating location. Kit is not included. He can never be the father of any dragons. He's more of a Ned Stark type, really, but hopefully with less beheading. And I mean, whilst that might seem frivolous, childish, or even unprofessional, This policy was really well received and it was highly effective. All of the team read it, they discussed it, it was clear in people's minds. Future updates, when people made them, even carried on the same theme. And it worked as a really great icebreaker for new staff. It got people engaged. And after all, what is the point of a policy? Well, it's to enable employees to behave in the way that the organisation wants. And that's it. This did that. It engaged staff, and there's nothing that says that the policies can't be fun or creative. So the next area is awareness and training. And as we've said, cybersecurity is a large, complex and rapidly changing field. It isn't practical to keep all employees fully up to date and fully trained on all the current threats and attacks that they face. Unless your job is cybersecurity, you've got your actual job to do. So you can't spend all of your time on cybersecurity. So we need to do enough training, but not too much. So we have to focus. It's important to focus on teaching the why and not just the how. What I mean here is probably illustrated best with using an example. So we'll use password best practice. You might have some training and your policy that states that all users must use passwords that are more than 12 characters long. That's great advice, but what happens when someone signs up to an online service that only allows a maximum of 12 characters? You've said you need a minimum. This service says maximum 12 characters. This does happen, unfortunately. Well, what then? You're going to rely on our users to make good, secure choices. But if they don't really understand why, if they don't understand the threats to passwords that they're defending against, it's really hard for them to make those good choices. We need to ensure that we teach people the risks to passwords and the way, as well as the ways to mitigate those risks. In that scenario, people are much more likely to follow the guidance if they understand why they should follow it. Secondly, your training should be frequent and regular. The annual one-off training or one-off training that lasts for hours and covers a whole load of topics in great detail is really important, and that's a valid part of any training regime. But you also need to follow up with more frequent awareness training. So it's the awareness side of things that we need to keep these things in people's mind. This could be just as simple as sending around frequent group emails reminding people about how to spot phishing attacks, or in times of increased risk, reminding people what to do when mistakes are made. Little and often is really much more effective than one big session each year. And factoring in frequent training sessions also allows you to respond to the changing threat landscape. You can update your training to reflect those new threats, changes in your policies, or changes in best practice. And finally, you should really encourage group participation. If you remember the health and safety analogy, cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, and encouraging participation from all employees really reinforces that. As an example, if someone receives a particularly convincing phishing email, then you could encourage those to send an email round informing people to be on their guard, perhaps taking screenshots from their email and highlighting where how to spot that as a fake rather than something that's real. Or you could encourage staff to share articles they've read on good security articles they've read, or something they've spotted in the news. The cybersecurity doesn't need to, or cybersecurity training doesn't need to come from one person all the time. It needs to be a shared responsibility. And the more people who interact with security, the more that security will be in everyone's mind. So the final part of this is the culture side of things. And this is possibly the most important step of the process, really. So it's a fact of life that mistakes happen. No amount of training, great policies, good practice, none of that is going to completely eradicate mistakes. So we've got to accept that they happen, learn to deal with them, and plan how to deal with them effectively. In cybersecurity, this is often referred to as a concept of assume breach. Essentially, we're saying that no protection is perfect, so we need to assume that at some stage we're going to experience a breach, and so we need to just accept that and understand that anyone at all can make them. The second part is that mistakes are rarely the fault of the employee. This can be challenging to accept sometimes from an employer's perspective, but it is mostly true. It might be due to inadequate training, or your employees could be rushing because they've got an excessive workload, or they've got unrealistic deadlines, or it might be that you've hired the wrong person, or it might just be because the phishing attack they fell for was really, really convincing, so convincing that probably anyone would have fallen for it. And so we need to accept accept that when mistakes happen, there's probably the case that we as an organization need to do something different and not just push that blame onto our employees. And this can sound like we're accepting poor performance or removing all responsibility from the employee, but this isn't the case. People are responsible for their actions, and of course, if someone does something that's outside of a policy or is just plain stupid, then of course they need to be held accountable for that. But what we can't do is we can't stigmatize mistakes and look to place the blame solely on the person who made it. Because if we actively discourage people, well, by doing so, we actively discourage people from owning up to the mistakes because it's difficult for them to do. And that's exactly the opposite of what we want to achieve. And we need to think about the difference between holding people accountable and laying blame. And that comes into the next thing is that we need to act fast. So swift, as it says, effective and swift response is crucial. To effectively mitigate risks that arise from breaches, your security team or whoever has the responsibility for security, they need to learn of mistakes as soon as possible. This is normally the case in all areas, but it's especially true in information security and cyber security. Your server, email, or your entire infrastructure could be fully compromised in minutes. So you can't hang around. So people need to know what to do when mistakes happen, and they need to feel safe to do so. And so if they do feel safe to admit mistakes, they're much more likely to act quickly and fully disclose all of their actions. And this is the outcome that we want to achieve. So in summary, we need to understand that information security is everybody's responsibility, and we can't rely solely on hardware and software for protection. We need to tell employees explicitly what's expected of them by implementing short, simple, and fun policies. We need to provide regular and frequent training and keep awareness in people's mind. Remember that little and often is better than long and infrequent. And we need to create a safe environment for people to admit mistakes. If we are focused on fixing problems and not laying blame. And so if we ignore the role of culture and people in maintaining information security, and we rely on software and hardware, or we expect the IT department to keep us safe, we're opening ourselves up to greatly increased and totally avoidable risk. providing employees with the training, direction and support they need to make good, secure choices, and allowing them to admit and to learn from their mistakes is much more time consuming and difficult to implement than a new firewall or updating our antivirus software. But in doing so, effectively, we're creating a human firewall that complements your hardware and your software, but together it makes you much more secure and provides a much more engaged and confident workforce. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for your time. I hope this has been useful. Chris, it's over to you. We've got time for any questions.
Thank you, Kit. Thank you for your time and thank you for your insight this morning. That's fantastic. So, yeah, we've now arrived at the Q&A. So we're happy to go through any questions you've got. If you've got questions, this is your time to get in touch and ask them. And you can do that on the Zoom menu. You'll see there's a Q&A box. So, yeah, please pop your questions in there. You could use the chat as well, but remember, if you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A box and then we can pick them up from there. Okay, so Kit, if you're ready, I'll get started with a couple of questions which have come in already. So I've got a question that's come in here. Where would you look at for training or best practice around any kind of security measures that you're looking to implement?
Yeah, so a good place is the National Cyber Security Centre, the NCSC. The government website there, they've got a whole load of really good scenarios and training for all sorts of levels. They have a really good set of simple infographics that you can get printed out and put up around the workplace for kind of raising awareness. And they've got a load of training material at a whole load of levels. There are also some government training that the companies can use in terms of the cyber essentials. They offer self-certified checklists essentially for you to go through as an organization to make sure you've got all the bases covered from cybersecurity, and that includes training in there. So that is a good start.
Okay, thank you for that. And quickly go on to another question. So someone's asking, what are some strategies that you'd recommend for making employees feel more safe about reporting mistakes?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things you can do. So one is seeing people own up to mistakes themselves, managers especially. You know, and we need to get the balance between, we're not trying to say mistakes are great and we're totally okay with mistakes, but seeing people admit to mistakes what can happen is people see that a mistake has happened and they see that someone hasn't been dragged over the coals for it and they've not been publicly shamed. You know, they've not been made to feel stupid, and that gives employees to see the employer's response to that, which would be, perhaps we need to offer some more training, or we need to get alongside people and say, you know, what could we have done differently to help you not make that mistake in the future? So it's really by just doing these things, by practicing what you're preaching, that will happen, and that change in mindset, that if someone makes a mistake, you know, rather than blaming people and saying, well, you shouldn't have done this, it's taking a step back and asking that question of, what could we have done differently to stop this happening in the future? And actually just going through that process over time. It will take time because people are going to be naturally nervous about admitting mistakes. People always are, but with time and with consistency, that culture will start to evolve. Yeah, I think that's probably the best strategy.
Okay, thank you, Kit. Now, without wanting to put you on the spot too much, because you've covered a lot of content today, this next question says, if you had to do one of the things that you've mentioned today, what would it be? So if you really had to kind of pick one as a starting point to get the ball rolling, making these changes, what, in your opinion, what do you think that would be?
Yeah, I think, like we've just talked about, I think the admitting mistakes and having a culture where people feel able to admit mistakes, and where people feel able to challenge things, that's probably the thing that I would try to start with, because the training is important. I mean, they're all important, yeah. So the policies, they're important. People need to know what their expectation is. Then you need the training to back that up. But even with all the training, mistakes will happen. And if people don't feel comfortable to admit mistakes, or even not admitting mistakes, but admitting that they don't know what they're doing, you know, if people feel safe to raise concerns and questions, then it allows you to evolve, or to create strategies to answer those problems, or to fix those problems. And so making people feel comfortable to challenge and to be engaged, you know, starting with encouraging people to share items around cybersecurity, they're really good. They're really good things to have. And once you've got that culture, people are engaged. So that will make any policies you introduce or any training you provide, that will make it so much more valuable, because people will be receptive to it. They'll know that they can question stuff, because training can be complex. You know, you can talk about all these things about different types of phishing, vishing, smishing, all these different terms. It can be really confusing. If you don't have the culture of questioning and admitting that you don't know what you're talking about at times, then some of that training is just going to be lost, and some of those policies are not going to be followed. So I would say getting the environment where people feel safe to admit mistakes and to ask for help and all those sort of things, that is the most important thing.
Thank you. And finally, the final question, similar to the last one, but I think you'll be well placed to answer this one. So what are some good ways for directors and other high level staff to show their commitment to security culture to the rest of the business?
Yeah, that is a good question. Really, it needs to be in, you know, we need to be talking about these things. So employees need to see that support for cybersecurity is something that is taken really seriously, and it's taken seriously across the board, and that, like we said previously, that policies apply to everyone. So people need to be seen to be following policies. It's no good me saying, here is our policy on password reuse or sharing passwords, or how we grant access to something, and then me running late for a meeting and calling you up, Chris, and saying, Chris, I really need you to share your password for this thing with me, because I need this data now. Then if that's not our policy, and we don't share passwords because we've got a process to go through to gain access to systems and what have you, then if I just ride roughshod over that, well, that devalues the whole thing, and people are going to see that, and people are going to think, well, what's the point of me doing that? So, you know, the managers and directors really need to be talking the talk, and they need to be walking the walk. I think that's the phrase, but practicing what they're preaching, that is the most important thing. And the practicing what they're preaching in terms of not blaming people and having that safe space, and also admitting their, you know, mistakes and shortcomings, and people saying, actually, I don't know what I'm talking about here. Could we have some training on this, or asking for advice? And so really just doing what they're expecting everyone else to be doing. That's probably the most important thing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for the answers there, Kit. So if everybody could just please join me in thanking Kit for his time and expertise this morning. It'd actually be great to hear what you thought of today's webinar. If you could let us know particularly what you found useful, if you just drop a little message in the chat, that would be really good feedback for us to pick up from there. Okay, and thank you all for your questions as well. If you found this useful, our next webinar is on Wednesday, the 5th of May at 10 o'clock, where we'll be looking at digital presenteeism and how that's affecting your workforce. I'll put the link to the chat. I'll put the link to the next webinar in the chat, and we'll also be sending you all a follow-up email, including a full recording of today's webinar and a reminder of our future webinar dates. So we hope to see you again soon on the next webinar. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a great day.